Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about exercise variation, because this is the sort of stuff you always hear people talk about over in the bodybuilding world, or the drug-heavy bodybuilding world, of muscle confusion, shocking muscles, all of that stuff. And most of us who understand training know that that's all nonsense. That's again something they can get away with due to drug abuse, and for the rest of the population that's not going to work. But the whole thing we come to with exercise variation, and what people need to understand, when you have people like me who promote exercise selection minimalism, that doesn't necessarily mean no variation. That absolutely doesn't mean that by any stretch of the imagination. What we're generally saying is that the less advanced a lifter is, the less variation that they are going to benefit from. And in fact, what we're saying is that excessive variation will actually produce inferior results. So when we're talking about novice lifters, they actually do need less variation. And I'm going to get to advanced lifters in a minute. People like me, because people are like, man, you rotate through some exercises, you're not practicing what you preach. But they don't understand that I absolutely am, and that for more advanced lifters, there's an injury prevention component to exercise variation. And it is noted in the literature and the research, and some really good coaches talk about it in detail out there. So when we come to novice lifters, though, let's be honest here. Novice lifters are generally not strong enough to get overuse injuries, right? They're generally not strong enough to get overuse injuries unless they push the volume way too far. So in other words, you can take a novice lifter and have them do one big basic exercise for their chest and triceps. So, I mean, you guys will see me here doing dips and close grip bench. Fine, pick bench press, do weighted dips, right? Pick one. Now, there can be problems with the dips for the novice lifter as a progression tool, so I generally lean in the direction of putting them under a barbell. But if a person is, a little more advanced than novice, and they can safely do dips, they could replace it, absolutely. They could use dips instead. But the point is, if they're using both of these things, in other words, if a novice is trying to focus on both the dip and the bench press, in my experience, they're going to probably get slower results. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it has to do with learning movement patterns and building a strength base on your basic movements. And what you need to understand, both of these exercises work essentially the same muscles. We could argue about ankles, and maybe the long head of the tricep might get slightly more work on a dip versus the bench press. We can argue about the stretch reflex, all of this stuff. We can argue about these points, but they're essentially the same movement in terms of what muscles get worked as the primary movers. Give or take, good 95% overlap. So you can build muscle in either one. The problem is you're learning two different movement patterns. We have a limited amount of recovery resources and a limited amount of motor patterns that we can learn and master at any given time. Now, a more advanced lifter who's already mastered certain movement patterns, things are a little bit different. But if you're in your first year of serious training, you are still learning these movement patterns. And like with anything else, practice makes perfect. In other words, just like most of you guys know that throwing a baseball or throwing a spear or throwing anything, right? There's a learning curve to it. There's motor patterns involved. And if you practice it, you get better at it. And I think there's a martial artist out there, who said something along the lines of, I don't fear the man who knows 10,000 different kicks. I fear the man who knows one kick and has performed it 10,000 times. All right, practice makes perfect, and the same with these lifts. So if you're splitting up your recovery resources into two separate lifts that are similar but not the same, you're going to develop less of the motor unit learning, less neuromuscular efficiency at it, and guess what? You're going to progress a hair slower at each one. Well, that's going to lead to less overload. It is overload that produces muscle growth. And by overload, I don't just mean your 1 rep max. I mean how much weight are you doing for 5 rep sets, 10 rep sets, right? If you're doing 5 sets of 5 or 3 sets of 10, the amount of weight on the bar and the distance you move it and everything else is going to be one of the primary determining factors in how much muscle you gain. So that strength that you're gaining by learning the movement pattern, beneficial there. So honestly, since you are still learning all these movement patterns, and that's going to be the primary mechanism by which you induce hypertrophy, a novice lifter doesn't need to be doing a lot of exercise variation. It's going to interfere with them building a strength base on those exercises. You know, a novice lifter honestly only needs to do about 5 or 6, maybe 7 exercises. Truth be told, they can build their entire body off that. They can build everything up and build a big foundation, a base. And if they actually just focus on the most efficient lifts they can, they're going to gain more muscle, more strength. Now, what does that mean for people who are trying to get in shape or fit or lose body fat? Higher metabolic rate, better energy turnover. Because if every workout you're performing, you're inducing more hypertrophy and you're doing more workload, you're burning more calories, more afterburn, and more muscle gain equals higher metabolic rate. That's even better for you guys. So the point is their gains are generally going to be better if they put their efforts into that. And that's not telling them, oh, you need to do less work. People say, oh, that's lazy. It's like, no, you need to, all the other work you were going to do on these 37 other exercises, you need to put back into that 6 or 7. You need to do more of them, not less. But that's the point we get to with them. Now we get to more advanced lifters. What's the problem we run into? We're stronger. We're strong enough to hurt ourselves. We are strong enough to hurt ourselves. What happens when we slip out of our movement pattern on a lift? Things get a little bit catawampus, so to speak. Well, when we slip out of our bar pass, when we're moving big, heavy, respectable weights, we do tend to get injured sometimes. We do tend to get injured sometimes. Also, different movement patterns, because of torques and stuff put on things, tend to cause injuries and inflammation in one specific spot sometimes, and a minor variation in an exercise changes that. So there's a fatigue management component to excessive specificity for more advanced lifters. And what I want to state here is this is not universally true. What I'm not saying is that someone who does Bulgarian training and focuses on 4 exercises, throw maxes every day for years on end, is necessarily going to get hurt. I'm not saying that, because there are people who successfully do that without getting hurt. And there are people with wide exercise variation who still get hurt. But exercise variation has to do with what happens when your technique goes wrong. And it has to do with accumulation of overuse injuries and fatigue management in regards to that. In other words, poor fatigue management is emerging in serious training to be the #1 cause of training injuries. There's a growing body of experts who are saying that it is poor fatigue management. Poor fatigue management is what's causing people to get hurt. Part of that fatigue management is localized overuse, right? Localized overuse of a specific tendon at a certain angle, things like that. So as we get more advanced and we start to feel inflammation and things, we might need to change the exercise up. And that could mean, like, guys are like, oh my God, why did you do dips for a few weeks and you've gone back to bench, you're flip-flopping? Notice I'm just as strong though. I have a strength base already on all of them. And I can take time off from bench press and just do dips and come back to the bench press and pick up within a week, have all of my strength back. Because I've accumulated a strength base and I am still stimulating hypertrophy in a similar movement pattern on something else. So I'm not going to lose progress. Keep in mind, I've been slow cutting here, guys. I'm not going to make vast progress unless it's off muscle memory like I'm about to do with my legs. So we need to think in terms of adjusting things to avoid overuse injuries. And it's not just about gains. It's not just about making progress. It's about letting connective tissue heal at certain angles and things so that we don't accumulate those injuries and that extra inflammation. It's also about learning a slightly different movement pattern. Because if we develop strength and joint angle specificity through a few similar movement patterns over time, what happens when we slip out of our bar path? We are more used to being able to at least handle that load when the bar shifts 2 inches in the wrong direction. If we've maybe done a little bit of training in that other direction, we're more suited to handle that load. We're less likely for things to go really bad, less likely to get hurt. And again, there's some good data on that. I think Greg Nuckols has put out stuff on that looking at it. That, yeah, lifters who do use a little more exercise variation, we're talking about very advanced lifters. I'm not talking about you guys who squat 300 pounds. We're talking about serious lifters that some exercise variation does seem to be associated with lower injury rates. And it is probably twofold in nature. It probably has to do with both of those factors. Both being able to handle stuff through slightly different variations in the bar path when form breaks down, and less accumulation of overuse injuries because you're still working the same muscles and sometimes similar movement patterns, but you're changing things up to where the connective tissue and stuff does get stressed at slightly different angles, and so it can heal a little better at times. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.